Dawn lay pale over Manchester Crown Court, washing the stone steps in a colour somewhere between ash and promise. Inside, the air held the hush of a chapel, reporters murmuring, a mother twisting a scarf, a boy too small for the chair he sat in. Ethan lowered his eyes and didn't speak. He hadn't spoken since the night the house learned how to echo. Then the side door opened and a German shepherd padded in, old around the muzzle, steady around the heart. Lumos didn't bow to the gavel or the cameras. He simply crossed the floor and settled at the boy's feet, as if he had always known the way. You could feel the room lean closer. The judge cleared his throat. The lawyers sharpened their pens. And there was Ethan, breathing like a bird in a storm, one hand hovering above a coat of thick, forgiving fur. When his fingers finally rested there, something unseen shifted, as if the truth had been standing in the back row all along, waiting for a place to sit. Before this day is over, a whisper will cross that dog's ear and tip the weight of a murder trial. Stay with this moment. You'll want to see how a courtroom learns to listen. Manchester Crown Court carried a weight that morning heavier than its stone pillars and carved oak benches. The air itself felt strained, as though silence had grown teeth. Reporters whispered in the back rows, pens poised, cameras set aside in grudging respect for the case that had already unsettled the city. Families of other cases sat rigid, drawn here as much by curiosity as by the gravity of tragedy. In the second row, near the front, sat Ethan Parker. 7 years old, too small for the wooden chair that creaked under him, he seemed swallowed by the cavernous courtroom. His mother rested a protective hand on his knee, but it was as though she was touching a shadow. Ethan's eyes remained cast downward, unmoving, fixed on the dark swirls of the floor. The boy hadn't spoken since the night his father died. Not a word, not a cry, not even a protest in his sleep. Teachers called it selective mutism. Psychologists wrote it off as trauma, and his mother called it grief. But in that courtroom, with rows of strangers watching, his silence felt like a verdict in itself, an unrelenting presence, louder than any testimony. At the bench, Judge Harrington adjusted his glasses, his expression one of restrained impatience. He was a man seasoned by decades of hearing lies, half-truths, and broken stories. But what unnerved him here wasn't what was said. It was what wasn't. His gavel had power over voices, yet it could do nothing against the wall of silence that clung to Ethan. On the opposite side, Prosecutor Adams shuffled papers with the deliberate gestures of someone who had already run out of patience. His jaw tightened with every glance at the boy. He had seen child witnesses before, terrified, tearful, confused, but they spoke. They pointed, they stumbled over words, but they spoke. Ethan did not. Adams leaned forward, muttering to a colleague, "How do you cross-examine silence?" The room held its breath when the court usher announced the start of the hearing. Shoes scuffed against stone as the audience settled into stillness. Ethan's mother pulled him closer, whispering something that didn't travel beyond their bench. Her face bore exhaustion, the kind that comes from battling institutions as much as sorrow. The shadows beneath her eyes betrayed countless sleepless nights, yet her posture remained firm, a shield of fragile dignity against the doubt surrounding them. "Bring the witness forward," Judge Harrington commanded, his tone clipped but measured. Ethan's name was spoken, but he didn't move. His mother coaxed gently, guiding him by the hand. Step by step, he walked toward the witness stand, his small shoes making almost no sound. When he sat, his feet dangled above the ground, swinging slightly as though searching for something solid. His gaze never rose from the wood beneath him. The press scribbled furiously, their murmurs fluttering like restless birds. To them, Ethan was no longer a boy, but a headline. Child witness silent in father's death trial. Yet what none of them could capture on paper was the suffocating atmosphere in the room, the way the silence seemed to accuse everyone present of not listening closely enough. "Ethan," Prosecutor Adams began, forcing his voice into a softer register than usual. "We just want you to tell us what happened. Anything you remember. You don't have to be afraid." No response. Not a flicker. Adams glanced at the judge, then back at the boy. He pressed again, his words sharp with rehearsed patience. "Did you see what happened the night your father died?" Still nothing. Ethan's hands clutched the edge of the chair, knuckles white. His lips parted as though a word was caught there, but it never came. The silence became unbearable. A cough echoed from the back. A pen clattered to the floor. Each sound rang too loud, mocking the void that Ethan left unfilled. Judge Harrington leaned forward, the irritation in his brow poorly concealed. "Mr. Adams, the boy's reluctance is clear. Unless you have an alternative method, we cannot drag words out of him." Adams bristled. "With respect, Your Honor, this case hinges on his testimony. Without it, the judge cut in, his voice low. You will need to build your case elsewhere." Ethan's mother shifted uncomfortably, her grip on her son's hand tightening as if she could squeeze courage into him. She bent close, whispering words that trembled with desperation. "Please, Ethan, just one word. For your father." But the boy sat unmoved, his silence a fortress too tall for even her to scale. The court recessed briefly, but the murmur of the crowd carried the same refrain. What good is a witness who will not speak? To them, the empty seat at Ethan's father's table had already been filled by another, silence itself. When the session resumed, Judge Harrington made a note in his ledger, his frustration sealed behind the formality of his robe. He didn't look at Ethan as he declared, "This court cannot proceed on speculation." The prosecutor sighed heavily, shoulders slumping in defeat. For him, Ethan was not just a boy. He was the key that refused to turn. And with each word unspoken, the weight of doubt grew heavier on the case. Ethan returned to his seat beside his mother. She brushed a hand through his hair, but he remained still, eyes locked on the ground as though the truth lay buried beneath it. To the world around him, his silence was a wall, but inside him, it was a scream no one else could hear. The courtroom's lamps cast a pale glow across the oak-paneled walls, but for Ethan Parker, the world was already dim. He sat stiff in the witness chair, feet dangling as though each second were an eternity he had been forced to endure. The murmurs had died down, but the silence that followed was no less crushing. Every eye was fixed on him, waiting for something, anything, that might fall from his lips. "Ethan," Prosecutor Adams said gently, almost as if coaxing a bird onto his hand. "Sometimes memories are like pictures. They come in pieces. Can you tell us if you remember what you saw that night?" The boy's gaze dropped to the polished wood of the bench. His fingers tightened around the edge until the grain left faint marks against his skin. He didn't speak, but the very air around him seemed to change. His pupils dilated, his shoulders tensed, and the hush of the room pressed down heavier, as though everyone present felt the stirrings of something unspoken. In the space behind his eyes, the courtroom dissolved. He was back in that house, his house, the one that no longer felt like home after that night. Shadows spilled across the stairwell, and the old steps groaned under a heavy weight. Ethan had been curled under his blanket, the fabric pulled tight around his chin, when the sound jolted him awake. Crack! The sound of someone descending, deliberate, patient. Through the thin slit between blanket and air, he remembered the way moonlight caught on metal. A ring. His stepfather's ring, glinting faintly, bobbing as the man carried something in his hand. Something long, something heavy. Ethan's heart had pounded so loudly he was certain it would betray him. Then, a cry, muffled quickly, as though the night itself had been gagged. He remembered his mother's voice, sharp and brief, cut off before the words could form. The silence that followed was worse than the cry. It had weight, a terrible finality that pressed into the walls, into his chest, into the marrow of his bones. Back in the courtroom, Ethan's breathing grew shallow. His small shoulders rose and fell faster, though his lips remained locked tight. "Ethan," Adams pressed softly, leaning just enough that his tone might reach the boy's hidden corner of fear. "Did you see who it was? Can you tell us?" The boy's eyes flicked up for the first time. Wide, glassy, trembling with unshed tears. He opened his mouth, then froze. His gaze slid instinctively to the gallery, to where Victor sat. The man's expression was calm, almost bored, but the faint curl at the corner of his lips spoke of something darker. His right hand, resting lazily on the bench, bore the glint of that same silver ring. Ethan's throat closed. He could not speak. The room seemed to lean in with anticipation. One boy, one truth, one chance to tear through the shadow that strangled them all. But nothing came. Only silence. Judge Harrington shifted uncomfortably in his seat, removing his glasses to rub the bridge of his nose. "If the child cannot testify, we must move on," he said, his patience fraying. Ethan's mother looked at him desperately, her lips moving without sound. "Please, Ethan." Her hand trembled against her chest, clutching the scarf that once belonged to her husband. The boy turned back to the floor. The images refused to leave. The ring glinting, the stairwell creaking, the cry swallowed by night. His small fists clenched until his nails cut into skin, but still no sound emerged. For the court, it was silence. For Ethan, it was the scream of memory. Prosecutor Adams sighed, his voice carrying the resignation of a man battling both the law and the limits of human frailty. "Your Honor, I have no further questions at this time." The gavel struck once, but its sound was lost in the roar inside Ethan's head. He wasn't in the courtroom anymore. He was back in that hallway, standing small and helpless as shadows turned to blood, and even now, no one believed him. The tension in Manchester Crown Court had thickened into something suffocating, a heaviness that clung to every bench, every whispered word, every anxious breath. On one side of the aisle, Prosecutor Adams stood rigid, his jaw locked, his papers trembling slightly in his hand. Not from nerves, but from a frustration too long contained. On the other, defense attorney Collins, sharp-suited and smiling like a man who had already won, tapped his pen against the table with a rhythm that grated on the nerves of everyone listening. "Your Honor," Collins began, his voice smooth as oil, "what we have here is the tragic imagination of a grieving child. The boy has been mute since his father's unfortunate accident. His silence is not evidence. It is grief, and grief can twist memories." Prosecutor Adams shot forward, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "With respect, this is not about imagination. This is about the inconsistencies in Victor Parker's account. His timeline, his injuries, his—" Collins cut in with a scoff. "Injuries? The man lost his wife. You dare put him on trial for mourning?" The words hung like barbed wire in the air. Judge Harrington lifted his gavel with warning, his stern gaze silencing the attorneys before their argument could spiral further. "Enough," he said firmly. "This is a court of law, not a theater." But it was already too late. The courtroom had turned into a performance for the crowd. Reporters at the back scribbled furiously, murmuring between themselves. Child witness silent. Case without evidence. Trial hanging by a thread. Their whispers slithered through the benches, feeding the doubt already gnawing at the edges of the proceedings. And then came the voice that cut through it all. Not from a lawyer, but from Ethan's mother. She rose suddenly, hands trembling as she clutched the scarf tied around her wrist. Her face, worn with sleepless nights and raw sorrow, tilted toward the judge. It was an accident, she insisted, her voice breaking in the echo of the chamber. Please, my son doesn't understand. He's confused. The room froze. Ethan's head jerked up slightly, eyes wide, searching her face as though she had betrayed him in the deepest way. His small hands tightened around the object he had been hiding in his lap all morning, a red toy car, chipped along the edges, its paint faded. His father had given it to him on his 6th birthday. It was the last gift before the night everything ended. He pressed the car into his palm so tightly the wheels dug into his skin. It was more than plastic now. It was a memory, a tether to the man whose absence had hollowed him. He wanted to scream, to shout, to tell them all that it wasn't an accident, that the creak of the stairs and the glint of the ring weren't just shadows of imagination. But his voice refused him. Prosecutor Adams looked toward Ethan's mother, disbelief clouding his features. Mrs. Parker, he said carefully, are you suggesting your son invented what he remembers? Her reply came soft, but her eyes flicked briefly toward Victor, sitting calm, hands folded neatly before him, his silver ring catching the light. Yes, that's what I'm saying. A wave of murmurs broke across the gallery, like a tide crashing against rock. The judge, exhausted by the stalemate, rubbed his temple with long fingers. This court will adjourn until tomorrow. Perhaps time will bring clarity. His gavel struck, but its sound was drowned in the restless stirrings of the audience. As the benches emptied, reporters whispered with the hunger of vultures circling a wounded animal. Case might collapse. Without the boy, it's over. Pens scribbled headlines before the ink was even dry. Ethan stayed seated. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't cry. He sat small and silent, his fist locked around the toy car, the edges biting into his skin as though pain might keep him from shattering altogether. Beside him, his mother bent to gather her bag, avoiding his gaze. Victor stood a row away, face carved into false grief, offering sympathetic nods to anyone who looked his way. But Ethan's eyes found him, just for a second, and what he saw in that faint smirk froze his blood. He dropped his gaze quickly, returning to the car in his hand. He traced the worn paint with his thumb, clinging to it as though it were his father's hand reaching back from the silence. Around him, the world of adults spun its web of lies and arguments. But inside the boy, something was breaking. Not his silence, it held firm, stronger than ever, but the fragile hope that anyone in that room truly wanted to hear him. As the court emptied, only the sound of pens and whispered doubts lingered in the air, and Ethan sat in the middle of it all, clutching his father's car, the weight of a truth too heavy for 7 years old, pressing him down like a shadow that would not lift. The courtroom was unusually quiet when Martha Parker took the stand. Her steps were slow, measured, the weight of eyes pulling her forward like an invisible chain. She was dressed in a dark dress that clung too tightly around her shoulders, as though it had been chosen not for mourning but for presentation. A folded tissue was crushed in her palm before she even sat down. "Please state your name for the record," the clerk prompted. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Martha Parker." Judge Harrington nodded, adjusting his spectacles. "Proceed, Mr. Adams." Prosecutor Adams rose, though there was no fire in his expression. He had interviewed Martha before, and he already knew what would come. Still, the formalities of the trial demanded performance. "Martha," Adams began softly, "can you tell us what happened the night your husband died?" The tissue twisted further in her hand. Her gaze dropped to the table, avoiding the gallery, the jury, and most of all, the small figure sitting at the front bench. Ethan. Her lips parted, and when she spoke, her voice carried a practiced sorrow. "It was late. Almost midnight. Daniel, my husband, he had been drinking. Just a little. He was upset about work." Her throat caught as though the memory still hurt, but her eyes remained dry. "He went upstairs. I stayed in the kitchen. Then I heard it." She paused, pressing the tissue against her lips. A thud. A terrible sound. Several jurors shifted uneasily. "Go on," Adams said gently. "I ran," Martha continued, her words almost rehearsed. "He had fallen down the stairs. He wasn't moving. I tried, I screamed, I called for help, but—" Her voice broke then, and a single tear rolled down her cheek, perfectly timed, as if it had been waiting for its cue. The courtroom stirred with sympathetic sighs, but not from Ethan. He sat frozen, eyes wide and unblinking. His small fists tightened in his lap. From where he sat, her story was a betrayal, painted in soft brushstrokes that erased the shadows he remembered. Adams nodded solemnly, as though he, too, were caught between sympathy and suspicion. "So, you maintain this was an accident?" "Yes." The answer came quick, firm, perhaps too firm. But then something flickered, just for a moment. Her hand, still clutching the tissue, rubbed against her wrist. Not an unconscious fidget, but a nervous ritual, as though she were scrubbing away something invisible. "And you saw no one else in the house that night?" Adams pressed. Her eyes darted sideways toward the defense table where Victor sat calm and composed. Then she looked back down, her lashes low. "No, just me and my husband." The silence that followed was thick with doubt. Adams paced slowly before her, his eyes narrowing, his voice sharpening. "And your son, Ethan? He claims otherwise. He claims there was another person. That someone else was there." The tissue twisted violently in her hands. "He's just a child. He doesn't understand what he saw." For the first time, she glanced toward Ethan, but only briefly, as though the sight of him scorched her. His gaze locked with hers, small and accusing, but she quickly looked away. The distance between them was deeper than any staircase, a canyon of truth she refused to cross. Defense Attorney Collins rose smoothly. "Objection. Speculation about what a child may or may not have seen cannot be treated as fact." "Sustained," Judge Harrington ruled, though his frown lingered on Martha a fraction too long. The jury scribbled notes, their expressions caught between sympathy and unease. Some leaned forward, studying her trembling hands. Others tilted their heads at the precision of her grief, the way her pauses landed too neatly, her tears too perfectly timed. When Collins took his turn, his tone dripped with reassurance. "Mrs. Parker, you loved your husband dearly, didn't you?" "Yes," she whispered, eyes shimmering but never spilling. "And his death was a tragic accident, nothing more?" "Yes." He smiled, satisfied, and turned back to the jury. "Then there is nothing further." But the damage lingered. As Martha stepped down from the stand, whispers rose in the gallery like a shifting tide. Some pitied her, some doubted her, and some, those who watched closely, noticed the tremor in her step, the way her eyes darted away from her son, as though his silence condemned her more than any lawyer could. Ethan didn't move when she passed him. He simply clutched the toy car in his pocket until its edges dug sharp against his palm. For him, her story was not his mother's grief. It was a wall of lies built carefully brick by brick, each word pushing him further into silence. And somewhere in that silence, the shadows of memory stirred restlessly, waiting to break free. The room smelled faintly of crayons and antiseptic. Bright posters lined the walls, smiling cartoon animals, cheerful alphabets, rainbows plastered across sterile white paint. It was supposed to feel safe, welcoming. But to Ethan Parker, sitting stiffly in the small chair, it felt like another cage. Across from him sat two psychologists, one male and one female, their faces arranged into masks of practiced warmth. A table between them held a tray of toys, building blocks, dolls, a set of colored pencils, and clean sheets of paper. "Ethan," the woman began gently, her voice carrying the softness of lullabies rehearsed too many times. "You can show us anything you like. You don't have to talk if you don't want to. You can draw, or play, or just sit. That's all right." The boy's hands stayed folded in his lap. His gaze was fixed downward, lashes brushing pale cheeks, his silence thick as stone. The man leaned forward slightly, careful not to crowd. "Sometimes children find it easier to draw what they feel. Would you like to try?" He slid a piece of paper and a pencil across the table. For a long moment, Ethan didn't move. The ticking of the wall clock filled the space, each second reminding the adults of time slipping away, of a trial waiting for answers that refused to come. Then, slowly, almost mechanically, the boy reached out and took the pencil. His small hand trembled at first, but once the lead touched paper, the movements steadied. The scratch of graphite broke the silence. The psychologists exchanged a glance, hope flickering. Ethan began with lines, vertical strokes, a frame, steps, a staircase. The woman tilted her head. "Is that your house, Ethan?" she asked carefully. No response. He continued. A dark shape at the top of the stairs. Broad shoulders. A hand extended downward. Not detailed, not clear, but unmistakably human. Then he added something small but sharp. A jagged mark carved into the hand, right across the knuckle. A scar. The woman leaned closer, her brows furrowed. "That's very good, Ethan. Can you tell me about this drawing?" The boy's pencil stopped. His lips parted slightly, as though words might finally break through. But then his gaze shifted. On the man's desk sat a mug, and beside it, a pair of reading glasses. The metal frame caught the fluorescent light, flashing for a brief second, too much like the glint of that ring. Ethan froze. The pencil slipped from his fingers, rolling across the table with a hollow clatter. His shoulders hunched, and his small body retreated inward, as if folding in on itself to vanish from sight. The room fell silent again, heavier than before. The psychologists tried. They pulled the blocks toward him, asked him to build something. He stacked 2 pieces, then abandoned them. They offered dolls, coaxing gently. "Can you show us who was there that night?" Ethan turned his face away, refusing to look. The woman tried another approach. She drew a smiling stick on her own paper and slid it toward him. "This is a family. Can you draw yours?" Ethan's eyes flickered to the paper. His small fingers reached reluctantly for the pencil again. Slowly, shakily, he added one figure, then another. A child, a mother. He hesitated at the third. When he finally drew it, the figure was darker, heavier strokes pressed into the page. The hand bore the scar again, looming over the others. He dropped the pencil and pushed the drawing away. The man exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "He's telling us something, but it isn't admissible," the woman finished softly. Her eyes lingered on the boy. His silence was not emptiness. It was resistance, a barricade fortified by fear. They tried one last time. The man held up a toy car, red paint chipped at the edges. "Do you like this, Ethan? Is this yours?" For a moment, something flickered in the boy's eyes. Recognition. Memory. His hand twitched toward it, but he pulled back quickly, pressing both fists into his lap, trapping them there. The silence swallowed everything again. The session ended with polite thank yous and reassurances, but the professionals' faces told the truth. They had failed. As Ethan left the room with his mother, the woman gathered the papers. She stared at the drawing of the staircase and the scarred hand, her chest tightening with unease. "It means something," she murmured. The man shook his head. "But meaning isn't evidence." He gathered the toys back onto the tray, the clatter sounding more like defeat than order. In the hallway, Ethan walked with his shoulders hunched, eyes on the floor. His mother's hand guided him, but he didn't respond to her touch. He pressed his fingers into his pocket, where the little toy car waited. It was the only thing that still felt like the truth. Inside the office, the drawing of the shadowed figure lay forgotten on the table, the scarred hand etched deep in graphite. To anyone else, it was just a child's scribble. To Ethan, it was the scream he couldn't let escape. And still, no one heard it. The chambers of Judge Harrington were far removed from the grand solemnity of the courtroom. But that didn't make the air inside any lighter. The heavy curtains were drawn against the early evening light, and the smell of old leather books and dust clung to the oak-paneled walls. Judge Harrington sat behind his wide desk, spectacles low on his nose, rubbing his temples with slow, deliberate circles. The weight of the trial had already begun to carve deeper lines into his face. Opposite him stood Prosecutor James Adams, sleeves rolled up, his file of notes clutched like a lifeline. "Your Honor," Adams began, his voice tight but insistent. "We are out of time. The boy won't speak, and without his testimony, we have nothing to anchor this case." Harrington's eyes lifted, weary and skeptical. "Then you may have no case, Mr. Adams. The law cannot lean on silence." Adams took a sharp breath, pacing a narrow strip of carpet. He stopped, turned, and said the words that had been gnawing at him since the last session. "There may be another way." The judge raised a brow. "Another way?" Adams hesitated. He knew how it would sound. "A therapy dog." The silence in the room was immediate, heavy. From the corner, defense attorney Collins gave a derisive laugh, sharp and humorless. He had been invited into chambers at Harrington's insistence, and his smirk said he was savoring every moment. "A dog. You want to introduce a dog as what? Counsel? Witness? We're in court, not a nursery." Adams ignored him, eyes fixed on the judge. "Not as a witness. As support. Ethan doesn't trust us, doesn't trust adults. But a dog, especially one trained to work with trauma survivors, might be able to break through his silence." Collins scoffed again. "So your plan is to parade an animal into this trial and hope the boy magically starts talking. Desperation doesn't suit you, Adams." Adams' jaw tightened, but he pressed on. "We've tried everything else. Psychologists, toys, drawings. Nothing has worked. His silence isn't empty. It's guarded. He's holding something back, and we need to give him a reason to let it out." Harrington leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. His expression remained stone, but the flicker of doubt in his eyes betrayed the internal war. "And you believe an animal will succeed where professionals have failed?" Yes, Adams said firmly. Because animals don't judge, they don't cross-examine. They don't ask leading questions or dismiss him as confused. If Ethan has any chance of speaking, it will be with someone or something he feels safe with. The judge exhaled through his nose, the sound more resignation than release. You're asking me to take this trial into uncharted territory, to allow a dog of all things into my courtroom. Do you understand how this will look to the press? They already think the case is collapsing, Adams replied, his tone edged with quiet urgency. They're writing headlines about a mute child, an incompetent prosecution, a grieving widow. If we lose this boy, Your Honor, we lose the truth. And we both know what that means. Collins stepped forward, shaking his head. This is madness. The jury will see it as a stunt, a pity ploy. You'll prejudice them against my client with theatrics instead of facts. Adam's eyes snapped toward him. Your client is guilty, and we both know the boy saw more than he can bear to say. Speculation, Collins shot back, smug. You're gambling with the integrity of this court. For a moment, Judge Harrington said nothing. He simply looked between the two men, weighing law against possibility, reputation against conscience. The room seemed to shrink around the decision waiting to be made. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice low but decisive. If I agree to this, it will be under strict conditions. The animal will not be presented as evidence. It will not be referenced in arguments. It will sit quietly beside the child, and nothing more. Do I make myself clear? Adams allowed himself the smallest exhale of relief. Crystal clear, Your Honor. Collins muttered under his breath. Unbelievable. But the edge in his voice betrayed his unease. He knew this unorthodox choice could change everything. The judge tapped his gavel lightly against the desk. Not a ruling, just a warning. This is not a precedent I intend to repeat. But if the boy speaks, if this allows the truth to be heard, I will allow it. God help us if this turns my courtroom into a circus. Adams nodded. His throat was tight, but in his chest flickered the faintest ember of hope. Thank you, Your Honor. As the men filed out of chambers, Collins muttered to Adams with a thin smile. A dog won't save your case. Adams didn't respond. His mind was already racing through names, files, units, who he could call, who had the right kind of dog, not just any therapy animal. He needed one with presence, with steadiness, with loyalty written into its very bones. He needed a dog who could sit beside Ethan Parker and make silence less terrifying. And though he didn't know it yet, that dog already had a name, Rexford. The morning session of Manchester Crown Court began under a hush that was different from the days before. There was no hum of impatient journalists, no restless shifting of benches. Instead, there was a quiet expectancy, as though every person present had caught the faint scent of something unusual in the air. The bailiff opened the side door, and into the charged silence walked Grace Williams, her stride steady but unhurried. She wore the plain navy uniform of the therapy dog unit, her badge clipped neatly to her breast pocket. At her side was Lumos, a German shepherd, whose coat carried the faded dignity of years. His muzzle had turned silver around the edges, but his amber eyes were steady, glowing with a calm gravity that seemed to soften the stone of the chamber itself. Conversations still, even the rustling of papers ceased. All eyes turned, not on Grace, not on the judge, but on the dog. Lumos moved with the slow assurance of one who knew no performance was needed. His gait was smooth, his paws silent against the marble floor. The heavy atmosphere that had clung to the court in recent days shifted, as though the dog carried something unseen with him. A stillness, a trust older than words. Reporters scribbled, but without the usual vigor. The words "therapy dog" had already been whispered in headlines the night before, dismissed by some as desperation, by others as novelty. But as Lumos crossed the room, none dared mock. Something in the way his gaze lingered on each face seemed to quiet every cynic. At the prosecution's table, Adams exhaled, shoulders easing as though the weight of doubt had lifted slightly. Beside him, his notes lay untouched. For this moment, the law stepped aside, letting presence speak where language had failed. At the defense table, Victor Parker sat rigid, his fingers drumming against the wood. His lawyer Collins gave a practiced smirk, but even he couldn't disguise the flicker of unease as Lumos passed within feet of them. The dog's head turned briefly, eyes brushing over Victor with a calm scrutiny that felt more searching than any cross-examination, and then Lumos stopped. He turned deliberately toward the front row. There sat Ethan, shoulders hunched, toy car gripped tightly in his lap. For days, the boy had kept his gaze fixed downward, eyes locked to the floor as though truth itself were buried in the wood grain. But now, for the first time, his eyes lifted. Amber eyes met hazel ones. The boy blinked. His lips parted slightly, not in words but in recognition, in something long dormant stirring awake. He didn't move at first, only stared, but then his small fingers relaxed around the toy car, loosening their desperate grip. The courtroom noticed. A ripple passed through the benches, like a held breath being released. Grace guided Lumos gently toward the witness stand, her voice calm and steady. "Sit." The old shepherd lowered himself gracefully to the floor, his bulk settling beside the empty chair meant for Ethan. His ears flicked once, then stilled. His breathing was slow, deliberate, the rise and fall of his chest like a metronome keeping time in the tense chamber. Judge Harrington leaned forward, his expression still stern but softened by something he would never admit. "Proceed," he said, though his tone carried less irritation than days before. Ethan's mother whispered to him, nudging him toward the stand, but this time the boy didn't resist. His eyes never left Lumos as he slid from his bench and walked hesitantly forward. The dog's tail gave a single gentle thump against the floor, not exuberant, not insistent, just acknowledgement. When Ethan sat, Lumos shifted subtly, pressing his warm flank against the boy's small legs. Ethan froze, then let the contact stay. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was waiting, tender and fragile. Prosecutor Adams did not speak right away. He let the moment hold, his eyes flicking to the jury, who leaned forward as if caught by a spell. He looked back at Ethan, noting the boy's gaze locked on the shepherd's graying muzzle. For the first time in days, Ethan wasn't staring at the floor. Adams finally cleared his throat. "Ethan, this is Lumos. He's here for you. You don't have to talk to me. You can talk to him." The boy didn't answer, but his hand twitched. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached down and touched the dog's fur. Lumos remained still, the faintest vibration of a sigh rumbling in his chest. Gasps whispered from the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously. "Boy touches therapy dog in silence." "Breakthrough?" The words were already forming into tomorrow's headlines. Victor's jaw tightened. His lawyer leaned close, whispering something urgent, but the man didn't hear it. His eyes were locked on the small connection forming in front of him, something he could not control, could not dismiss as easily as testimony. Ethan's hand lingered on the shepherd's back. His lips pressed together, but his gaze was no longer empty. It was searching, watching. The silence in the courtroom had shifted entirely. It was no longer suffocating. It was alive, waiting for a child to find his voice. And for the first time, the possibility seemed real. For a long moment, Nothing moved in the courtroom. The gavel was silent, the shuffle of papers forgotten. Even the scratching of reporters' pens had ceased, as if the entire room were holding its breath. Ethan sat on the witness chair, his small frame taut with hesitation, the toy car pressed into his palm like an anchor. At his feet, Lumos waited. The German shepherd's calm presence seemed to absorb the tension, his amber eyes steady, his breathing slow. He did not look at the jury, nor at the judge. His gaze rested only on Ethan, patient and unwavering. The boy's shoulders trembled. His hands hovered uncertainly above his lap, then retreated, then inched forward again. The conflict was written in every small motion, fear pulling him back, something softer urging him closer. Grace Williams, the handler, did not intervene. She stood just behind, arms loosely folded, her posture deliberately unthreatening. She had seen this moment before, the fragile edge where a child either crumbles or steps into trust. Her eyes stayed on the shepherd, knowing Lumos would do what years of training had prepared him for. Nothing but presence. The first sound was faint but distinct, the slow thump of Lumos's tail against the marble floor. Once. Then again, not eager, not demanding, but a steady signal. I am here. Ethan's breath caught. His eyes widened, darting briefly to the judge, then back to the dog. Lumos didn't move. He simply lifted his head, ears relaxed, gaze never wavering. The boy's hand shook as he extended it, hovering inches above the thick fur of Lumos's neck. His fingers twitched, then drew back sharply, retreating as if the very idea of touch was too much. A ripple of disappointment stirred in the gallery, a faint exhale from the jurors. But then Lumos shifted, not toward the boy, not invading the fragile space between them, just closer by a fraction, his warm flank pressing a little more firmly against the boy's shins. Ethan froze. His lips parted, his eyes darted down, and his hand, hesitant, trembling, lowered once more. This time his fingers brushed the shepherd's fur. Thick, warm, alive. The boy gasped quietly, as if the sensation itself had startled him. His small hand lingered, curling slightly into the coarse coat, and then pressed down. The spark was so small it might have been missed. But in that courtroom, where silence had been heavy and hopeless for days, it was as if someone had struck a match in the dark. Prosecutor Adams saw it first. His breath hitched, his eyes softening. He had gambled everything on this moment. And here it was. Not words, not yet, but something that carried even greater weight. Trust, fragile and new. The jurors leaned forward, their pens forgotten. The press scribbled furiously, but their usual cynicism was gone. Their eyes were wide, caught by the quiet miracle before them. Even Judge Harrington, who had grumbled at the very idea of a dog in his courtroom, found himself adjusting his spectacles not to read a document, but to watch a boy's trembling hand rest in the fur of an old shepherd. Across the aisle, Victor's jaw tightened. His hand clenched around his silver ring, twisting it against his knuckle until the skin reddened. Collins, the defense attorney, muttered something under his breath, but Victor didn't hear. His eyes were locked on the sight in front of him, a bond forming that he could neither control nor dismiss. Ethan's hand remained where it was, his fingers slowly relaxing. His shoulders, always tense, sagged slightly, as though some invisible weight had been eased. His lips pressed together, but his breathing steadied. For the first time in weeks, his silence no longer looked like fear. It looked like choice. Lumos sighed softly, a low rumble that vibrated against the boy's skin. Ethan blinked rapidly, his eyes glassy. He glanced at the jury, then at the prosecutor, then back to Lumos. Still no words. But everyone in the room understood. Something had shifted. Adams did not push. He simply nodded, his voice gentle. "That's all right, Ethan. That's enough for now." The boy's hand tightened briefly in the shepherd's coat, as if holding on to that reassurance. In the gallery, a woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. A reporter lowered his pen, unable to write, while his throat closed against unexpected emotion. The silence that had haunted the courtroom was still there, but it was different now. No longer suffocating, but alive, heavy with possibility. Judge Harrington cleared his throat, his voice uncharacteristically hushed. "Very well. The court will recess." His gavel struck once, but the sound was almost unnecessary. The session was already sealed in every heart present. As people rose, whispers rippled like wind through leaves. "Did you see it?" He touched the dog. "First time he's looked up in days." The words carried awe rather than doubt. Ethan remained seated, his hand still resting on Lumos's fur. His toy car slipped from his other hand and clattered softly against the floor, but he didn't notice. For the first time since his father's death, he had let go of it. Grace caught Adams's eye, a small, knowing nod passing between them. This was only the beginning, but beginnings mattered. Ethan leaned ever so slightly against the shepherd, his body tilting as though testing the weight of trust. Lumos did not move, except for a single slow thump of his tail against the floor. And in that quiet, fragile contact, the boy found what words had denied him, a reason to hope. The courtroom did not disperse quickly after recess was called. People lingered in the wooden benches, their coats folded across their laps, their voices hushed but urgent. Even as the bailiff called for order, a current of wonder still moved through the room, an unspoken acknowledgement that they had all just witnessed something subtle yet profound. At the center of it sat Ethan, his small frame half-shadowed by the wooden witness chair. He had not moved since the gavel struck. The red toy car, fallen from his hand, lay on the floor unnoticed. All his focus, all his fragile stillness, rested on Lumos. The German shepherd had settled at the boy's feet, his body curled protectively, head resting on his paws. He made no demand, no move to climb or lick or nudge. His presence was enough. Ethan's breathing, once shallow and uneven, had slowed. Each inhale seemed steadier, each exhale softer. The boy's shoulder brushed against Lumos's flank, and though it might have seemed accidental, there was intention in the way he let it linger. It was not yet trust spoken aloud, it was trust whispered through contact. Judge Harrington sat at his bench, spectacles balanced at the end of his nose. He had seen hundreds of witnesses in his long career, some broken, some defiant, some brazenly false. But never this. A boy who spoke nothing, and yet whose silence was changing the air of the court more powerfully than words could. His gaze softened, though he quickly disguised it behind a frown and a scribble of his pen. From his seat, Prosecutor Adams did not speak. He only watched. He had learned enough in his years of law to recognize when words would ruin what silence was building. For once, silence was not the enemy. It was the foundation. On the other side, defense attorney Collins muttered to Victor in a low hiss, "It's nothing, just theatrics. The jury won't care about a boy petting a dog." But Victor's jaw tightened. His ring turned round and round his finger, faster now, his knuckles whitening. He saw what others saw, but could not admit. The boy's silence had shifted. It was no longer a wall, it was a bridge, and a dog had laid the first stone. The bailiff opened the doors to usher people out for the break. Reporters shuffled reluctantly, some turning back to glance again at the child and the shepherd. Their notes were messy, their whispers fevered. He touched the dog, leaned on him. First sign of progress. This could change everything. But Ethan heard none of it. His hand rested lightly in the thick fur at Lumos's neck, his fingers curling and uncurling slowly. It was a nervous rhythm, like someone learning to breathe again. Grace Williams, the handler, stood quietly nearby. She had seen children in the worst storms of silence, some shattered by violence, some swallowed by fear. And yet she had never stopped believing in the quiet power of a dog's presence. Now, as she watched Ethan lean more fully against Lumos's flank, she felt the same old truth. Trust begins where words end. Ethan's eyelids fluttered briefly, the kind of flicker that came when memory pressed too close. He shifted, pressing his forehead into the shepherd's side, burying himself in warmth that did not judge, did not demand. Lumos didn't move, save for a slow thump of his tail, as if to say, "Stay as long as you need." The boy's heartbeat, erratic and sharp in the morning, had steadied now. It echoed softly against the shepherd's ribs, two rhythms slowly aligning. The room, though half-emptied, carried a reverent stillness. Judge Harrington looked up once more, pen frozen above his ledger. His stern mouth twitched, not into a smile, but into something almost gentler. He knew what the law demanded, what evidence required, but he also knew when something unseen was at work. He adjusted his spectacles, then set them down entirely. For the first time since the trial began, he allowed himself a quiet thought. Perhaps the truth does not arrive in words first. Perhaps it arrives in the courage to reach out. Ethan shifted again, sliding down in his chair, just enough that his knees brushed Lumos's fur. The shepherd stirred slightly, turning his head until his chin rested against the boy's shoe. The contact was simple, but in that courtroom, it felt monumental. The whispers of reporters faded behind the heavy doors. The murmurs of lawyers waiting for recess died away. What remained was a child, a dog, and the fragile thread of trust knitting itself in silence. No one spoke. No one dared interrupt. And Judge Harrington, who had once dismissed the idea of a therapy dog as nonsense, now sat in watchful quiet, knowing something important had begun, something that might yet turn silence into truth. The next morning, Manchester Crown Court was brimming before the gavel ever fell. The gallery filled early, reporters jostling for the best vantage point, pens scratching against fresh notepads. There was no denying it now. Yesterday's scene had spread beyond the courtroom walls. Headlines across the city carried the same quiet astonishment. Boy breaks silence through therapy dog. Judge Harrington entered with the same stern expression, yet his eyes betrayed the fatigue of a man already bracing for another unconventional day. He took his seat, shuffled papers with unnecessary precision, and finally nodded to the bailiff. "Bring the witness forward." The doors opened. Grace Williams led Lumos in first. The shepherd padded into the chamber with the same unhurried grace as before, his amber eyes steady, his gait deliberate. There was something almost ceremonial in the way he crossed the floor, an unspoken reminder that dignity was not always human. Ethan followed a step behind, clutching the toy car in his palm. His shoulders were still drawn inward, but his eyes no longer stared only at the floor. Instead, they flicked toward the shepherd, as though tethered by invisible string. They reached the witness stand together. Lumos settled immediately at the boy's feet, curling into position without a sound. His tail swept once across the polished floor before going still. The boy slid into his chair, his small shoes brushing lightly against the shepherd's flank. The courtroom stilled. No one coughed, no one shifted. All eyes waited. At first, Ethan did nothing. His gaze locked onto the toy car, turning it in his hands. The silence stretched, tense, but not suffocating this time. Alive, expectant. Then slowly, deliberately, the boy lowered his head, His lips moved, faint and hesitant. A whisper. The sound was too soft for anyone else to hear. Not the judge, not the jury, not even Prosecutor Adams, who leaned forward instinctively, straining to catch it. Only Lumos, ear tilted slightly toward the child, received the words. Ethan's hand slid into the thick fur at the shepherd's neck as he whispered again, the movement of his lips barely visible. His brow furrowed, his eyes glistened, but the words flowed in fragments, meant only for the dog's ear. Grace noticed first. She had been watching not the boy's lips but his shoulders, the minute shift in posture that betrayed release. Her chest tightened as she realized what was happening. Ethan was speaking, not to the court, not to the adults who had failed him, but to Lumos. She caught the faint movement of his mouth, the rhythm of hushed words spilling against the shepherd's fur, but she could not hear them. None of them could. The courtroom remained frozen in reverent silence. Reporters leaned forward with sharpened ears, only to be met with the frustrating truth. Whatever he said belonged only to the boy and the dog. Adams's throat tightened. He wanted to interject, to ask, "What is he saying?" But instinct told him not to. Forcing it now would shatter the fragile thread that had begun to weave itself between child and truth. Judge Harrington adjusted his spectacles, his expression unreadable. For a man long accustomed to evidence and testimony, the idea that justice might be whispered into a dog's ear tested every fiber of his pragmatism. Yet even he could not deny the shift he saw. The way Ethan's hand tightened in Lumos's fur, the way the boy's lips formed words at all. Victor sat stiffly at the defense table, ring twisting around his finger. His jaw clenched as he leaned toward Collins, muttering in a tone meant to be unseen. Collins smirked, but there was no amusement in Victor's eyes. He stared at the child, whispering into the shepherd's ear, as though each unspoken syllable were a stone stacking against him. Minutes passed. To the court, they were only silence, but for Ethan, they were confessions long buried. The creak of stairs, the cry swallowed by night, the silver glint of a ring. He spoke them not as testimony, but as secrets, trusting that the shepherd would hold them without judgment, without betrayal. When at last his lips stilled, Ethan let his forehead rest lightly against Lumos's shoulder. His breathing slowed, steadier now, the faintest calm settling over his features. Grace's throat tightened, her fingers flexing at her sides. She knew she had just witnessed the first crack in a wall of silence built too high for human voices to breach. The judge cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "Court will recess briefly." His gavel struck once, though softer than usual, as though even he was reluctant to disturb what had just taken place. The room exhaled as one. Reporters scribbled frantically, but their faces betrayed frustration. They had no words to print, only the knowledge that something extraordinary had happened in whispers no one else could hear. Ethan remained in his seat, his hand never leaving Lumos's fur. The shepherd shifted slightly, leaning just enough to meet the boy's touch more firmly, as though acknowledging a pact neither of them needed to voice. Judge Harrington watched quietly from his bench, his pen unmoving over the page. For the first time, he did not scold or press for evidence. He simply observed, knowing that what had begun was not for the court to control. In the stillness of that chamber, justice itself seemed to pause, waiting for the boy's voice to grow strong enough to be heard beyond the shepherd's ear. The courtroom was still humming from the recess, a low tide of voices filling the wooden chamber as people returned to their seats. Reporters leaned forward, eager, pens poised. Jurors adjusted their chairs, bracing for another long day of silence and disappointment. Yet in the witness stand, Ethan Parker sat with his hand buried in the thick fur of Lumos, the German shepherd, whose presence had already unsettled the rhythm of the trial. Grace Williams stood quietly near the rail, her posture calm, her gaze fixed on the boy and the dog. She had seen many children fold inward under the weight of fear, but she also knew the peculiar miracle that could happen when trust was given space to bloom. The faint movement of Ethan's lips earlier had not been lost on her, nor had the way he leaned into Lumos afterward, as though the shepherd had absorbed some unbearable secret. Now the room waited. Prosecutor Adams rose slowly, cautious not to startle what was still fragile. He spoke not to the boy, but into the air, his tone softer than it had ever been in court. "Ethan, you don't have to be afraid here. Lumos is listening, and if you want, we will listen too." The boy's head remained bowed, cheek pressed against the shepherd's neck. His small fingers twisted into fur, holding tight, as if words might slip from his hands if he let go. The silence stretched. A cough echoed from the gallery. A pen dropped with an awkward clatter. Then, softly, barely audible, a voice cracked the stillness. "The man." The word was so faint, many weren't sure they had heard it at all. Gasps rippled across the benches. A reporter froze with his pen in mid-air. Even Judge Harrington straightened sharply in his chair. Ethan swallowed, his lips trembling. His eyes flicked to Lumos, whose steady amber gaze did not waver. He pressed his forehead harder into the shepherd's fur, then whispered again, louder this time, enough to reach the edge of the jury box. "The man with the scar." Adams leaned forward, heart pounding. "Ethan, can you say it again?" His voice trembled, though he masked it quickly. The boy's chest rose and fell, fast and uneven. His voice came again, fragile but breaking free. "The man with the scar pushed Daddy." The words fell into the room like stones into water, shocking, irrevocable, sending ripples through every soul present. The courtroom froze. Jurors stopped breathing mid-inhale. Reporters stared at each other, eyes wide, pens scratching furiously. A woman in the gallery pressed her hands to her mouth, muffling a cry. At the defense table, Victor Parker went rigid. His ring twisted once on his finger, then stilled. Collins's smirk faltered, his practiced composure slipping as whispers surged through the benches. Judge Harrington's gavel struck once, hard, but the sound did little to cut through the electricity charging the chamber. He cleared his throat, voice firm. "Order! This court will have order." But even as the noise died, the words remained, echoing in every corner. "The man with the scar pushed Daddy." Ethan lifted his head slowly. His eyes, glassy but fierce, met Adams's for the briefest second before falling back to Lumos. He leaned into the shepherd again, trembling, but the dam had been breached. He had spoken, and nothing could undo it. Adams's chest tightened. He forced himself to remain steady, not to rush, not to overwhelm. "Ethan," he said gently, "you're very brave. Can you tell us who the man with the scar is?" The boy's lips pressed shut again. His small shoulders stiffened, but his hand clutched Lumos more tightly, as though drawing strength from the shepherd's steady warmth. His silence now was different, not absence but resistance, waiting for the right moment to continue. The judge studied the boy over the rim of his spectacles. For once, his voice was quiet, almost respectful. "Mr. Adams, I suggest you proceed with care. This court has just witnessed something significant." Adams nodded, his eyes never leaving the child. "Yes, Your Honor." The room shifted uneasily back into order, but the air had changed. What had once been hopeless silence was now testimony, fragile, imperfect, but real. Ethan lowered his head once more, lips brushing the shepherd's ear as if returning to the only listener he trusted. Grace watched closely, her pulse racing. She couldn't hear the words, but she knew from the boy's trembling lips and the tight clutch of his fingers that more was coming, piece by piece. For the jury, for the judge, for the press. It didn't matter that the words were few. They had heard enough to tilt the balance of everything. The boy had spoken. And in those first words, truth had entered the room. For a heartbeat after Ethan's words fell into the courtroom, the air felt too heavy to breathe. The man with the scar pushed Daddy. It hung there, raw and unshakable, as though carved into the very oak walls of the chamber. At the prosecution's table, Adams froze, the pen in his hand suspended mid-note. His years of trial work had taught him to listen for hesitation, for cracks in testimony, but this was no hesitation. It was a rupture. A child's silence had splintered, and the truth had spilled out like light through a broken window pane. Across the aisle, chaos erupted. Defense attorney Collins lurched to his feet, voice sharp. "Objection! This is a frightened child's fantasy, not admissible testimony." But his words carried no weight. The jury wasn't looking at him. Their eyes were fixed on the boy who had finally spoken. At the front row, Martha Parker's face was drained of color. Her hand flew to her mouth, tissue crumpled in her trembling fingers. For weeks, she had insisted on accident, on misstep, on grief, blurred into tragedy. But now, hearing her son's voice pierce through the silence, she seemed almost struck by the force of it. Her lips moved without sound. No. No. But her eyes betrayed something darker than denial. They betrayed fear. Reporters came alive like startled birds, pens scratching furiously, heads snapping toward one another in wide-eyed confirmation. Whispered headlines hissed through the benches. Child named scarred man. Shock testimony shakes trial. Silent witness speaks at last. Ethan sat small in the witness chair, his hands tangled in Lumos's fur, his chest heaving with the effort it had taken to speak. His voice was still fragile, trembling at the edges, but it was no longer absent. The wall of fear that had trapped him for weeks had cracked open, and though the crack was narrow, it was enough to let the world hear. Grace Williams watched from her corner, her throat tightening as she caught the shift in the boy's posture. His head was still bowed, his eyes darting toward the shepherd for reassurance. But there was no mistaking it. The child had crossed an invisible threshold. Judge Harrington, long a skeptic of the dog's presence, sat forward with his brows knit tightly, his gavel raised but forgotten. His voice, when it came, was low but steady. "The statement will remain on record." He looked directly at Collins, silencing further protest with the steel of his tone. The defense attorney sputtered. "Your Honor, this is a dangerous precedent. A child whispering to a dog and suddenly—" "Enough," the judge cut him off. The words carried finality. Victor Parker, seated beside his lawyer, had gone rigid, his ring twisted violently on his finger, leaving red marks along the skin. His face was taut, expression controlled, but his eyes flickered with panic he couldn't quite mask. For the first time since the trial began, his confidence cracked. The jury saw it. They noted the pale mother, the trembling child, the scarred stepfather whose jaw was clenched too tightly. They saw more than evidence. They saw a story, human and unfiltered, playing out before them. Ethan's voice quavered as he whispered again, softer now, as though retreating to the one ear that mattered. His lips brushed Lumos's fur, his words swallowed by the shepherd's patient stillness. The courtroom couldn't hear, but the silence that followed was deafening. Adams steadied himself. He wanted to press forward, to dig deeper, but instinct told him to let the moment breathe. Too much force now would collapse the fragile courage the boy had found. He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the witness has spoken. For the first time since his father's death, he has given us words that cannot be dismissed." The judge's gavel tapped once, softer this time. "It will not be dismissed." His eyes swept across the courtroom. "This court will reconvene tomorrow. Until then," his voice faltered almost imperceptibly, then steadied. "Let the record show that the witness has broken his silence." The chamber erupted again as people rose from their benches, voices colliding in astonishment. Reporters rushed for the doors, eager to beat one another to the first headline. Jurors exchanged uneasy glances, their notebooks already filling with underlined words. Scar, pushed, daddy. Through it all, Ethan remained in his chair, his forehead resting against Lumos's shoulder, his small body trembling, but unbroken. His silence was not gone, not entirely. But it was no longer a prison. It was a choice, and now the world knew he could speak when he felt safe enough to do so. Martha sat in the gallery, pale and rigid, her eyes fixed on the boy. She did not rise, did not follow the tide of people leaving. She only whispered to herself, words no one else could catch. Her face was that of a woman, watching her world unravel. One thread tugged loose by the smallest, quietest hand. The boy had spoken, and in that fragile voice, the silence of the trial shattered. The following day, the courthouse carried a different kind of silence. It was no longer the suffocating quiet of disbelief, but the taut pause of a community bracing for what might come next. Reporters filled the benches earlier than usual, their pens ready to etch the continuation of a story that had begun to spread far beyond Manchester. In a smaller chamber adjoining the courtroom, investigators had gathered. Files were spread across the long table, photographs, typed transcripts, reports yellowed with overuse. The case, once thought straightforward, now looked riddled with cracks. Detective Claire Morrison leaned over the evidence, her finger tracing along the timeline Martha Parker had given in her testimony. She said Daniel was alone on the staircase, that she heard the thud from the kitchen. Her voice was flat, professional, but her eyes carried something sharper. Doubt. Across from her, Prosecutor Adams tapped his pen. Restless. And now we have Ethan. The man with the scar pushed Daddy. It isn't much, but it's more detail than we've had in weeks. Children misremember, Defense Attorney Collins would argue later. Adams knew that. But he also knew when a child's words carried the weight of lived truth. The door creaked open. Grace Williams stepped in, Lumos at her side, Ethan following closely behind. The boy clutched his toy car in one hand, his gaze wary, but no longer locked to the floor. They settled him gently at the end of the table, Lumos lowering himself beside the chair. The shepherd's head rested on Ethan's lap, a steady anchor in the sea of adult eyes. Claire crouched slightly to meet the boy's level, her voice calm. Ethan, you don't have to be afraid. Yesterday, you were very brave. You told us something important. Can you remember anything else? The boy's lips pressed together. His fingers traced the edge of the toy car, round and round, until the plastic squeaked softly under his grip. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, slowly, his gaze unfocused, drifting somewhere far away. His voice was no more than a whisper. I saw a ring. Adams leaned forward, careful not to interrupt. A ring? Ethan nodded. his eyes still on the distance. Silver. It caught the light. When he pushed. Grace's chest tightened. She had watched children recall horrors before, but something in Ethan's tone, fragile, unforced, rang of clarity. Claire glanced at Adams, then back to the boy. And this man, did he have anything else? Something about his hand? The boy's breath shuddered. He closed his eyes, as though replaying the moment frame by frame. There was a scar. His own hand lifted, small fingers brushing across his knuckles. Here, like a line. Adam's pen clattered against the table. He remembered Martha's testimony too well. There was no one else in the house that night. Just me and my husband. She had sworn it under oath. No mention of Victor. No mention of scars. Yet Victor Parker wore a silver ring, and he bore a scar, plain across his knuckles. The boy's whisper grew steadier, carried by the rhythm of his hand in Loomis's fur. He pushed Daddy. On the stairs, Daddy fell. I heard. His voice cracked then, collapsing under the memory. His fingers tightened in the shepherd's coat until his knuckles went white. Lumos shifted, pressing closer, his steady breath filling the boy's silence. The investigators exchanged glances. Adams's heart hammered. These were not random fragments. They were details too sharp, too consistent to ignore. Details that cut holes through Martha's carefully painted story. Claire rose, her voice crisp now, directed at the room. We need to re-examine the staircase photographs. Look at the height, the angle of the fall. If someone shoved him, the injuries would be different than a simple misstep. Adams nodded firmly. And we need to subpoena Victor's medical records, any documentation of that scar. From the corner, Grace kept her gaze on the boy. Ethan's chest was still rising too fast, his face pale, but there was a steadiness now, hidden beneath the fear. He had spoken again. He had remembered. The boy leaned into Lumos, whispering words no one else caught. The shepherd's tail swept once against the floor, as if answering in his own quiet language. Martha Parker's earlier testimony replayed in Adams's mind. He was alone. He fell. It was an accident. But the pieces no longer fit. The glint of a ring, the scarred hand, the shove on the staircase. They were not fragments anymore. They were a story. And for the first time, it was Martha's story that seemed like fabrication. Adams looked across the table, his voice hard. We've been chasing an accident, but this isn't an accident. It's a cover-up. And the boy's memory may be the key to unraveling it. The room went silent again, heavy with the realization that the case had shifted. At the end of the table, Ethan pressed his forehead into Lumos's fur. His small shoulders trembled, but his voice, when it came, was steady enough for them all to hear. I didn't forget, he whispered. I was just scared. And with those words, the investigators knew the silence that had once bound him was broken. The late afternoon light filtered through the blinds of the Manchester precinct, casting stripes across the cluttered conference table. Files were stacked high, crime scene photos spread out, evidence bags labeled and numbered. The hum of fluorescent lights above was the only sound as detectives leaned over the growing puzzle that refused to fit together. Detective Claire Morrison slid a new file into the center. We've been too focused on Victor, she said quietly, her voice taut with fatigue. But Ethan's words, the man with the scar, the ring, don't necessarily point only to him. Prosecutor Adams looked up, brow furrowed. Victor fits the description. Partly, Claire countered, flipping the file open. A photograph of a broad-shouldered man stared up at them, features a hard expression caught mid-glare in a mugshot taken years earlier. A name was stamped in bold across the page, Leonard Kane. Kane? Adams frowned. Daniel's old business partner. Business rival, Claire corrected, tapping her pen against the file. They co-owned a property development firm until the falling out last year. Lawsuits, accusations of embezzlement. Word is, Kane felt Daniel had cheated him out of his share. When Daniel died, the inheritance of the last standing assets went to Martha. Kane was left with nothing. She flipped another page. A photo slid free, Kane in a candid shot outside a pub, his hand raised mid-gesture. There, across the knuckles of his right hand, ran a jagged line of scar tissue, stark and pale against his skin. Adams leaned forward, his jaw tightening. Scar on the right hand. And this. Claire placed another photo beside it. Kane shaking hands at a fundraiser, a heavy gold ring glinting on his finger. Thick, ornate, the kind that caught light easily even in dim rooms. The pieces began to click. Ethan said silver, Adams muttered, conflicted. But for a child in shock, metal is metal, a ring that catches light. Claire nodded. Exactly. It matches. And the scar. Ethan was precise. He didn't imagine it. This man fits the description. Silence hung for a beat, broken only by the shuffle of papers. Adams exhaled sharply, pacing the narrow strip of floor between the table and the wall. So, we've been circling Victor, while the real motive might be elsewhere. Victor still has motive, Claire reminded. But Kane had something more tangible. Money. An entire fortune slipping through his fingers. And Daniel stood in the way. Another detective, Sergeant Holt, chimed in. We pulled Kane's finances. He's drowning. Loans unpaid. Properties tied up in lawsuits. If Daniel died and Martha inherited, Kane stood to negotiate for a peace, or pressure her into selling. His rage at being cut out was no secret. Adams stopped pacing, his mind spinning. The courtroom echoed in his memory. The child's fragile voice, the words trembling but clear. The man with the scar, push Daddy. For the first time, the image sharpened. Perhaps it hadn't been Victor at all. Perhaps the enemy had been standing just outside their vision. Grace, who had been sitting quietly in the corner with Lumos at her feet and Ethan beside her, spoke softly. Ethan never said Victor's name. He only described a scar, a ring. We filled in the rest. The boy sat still, clutching his toy car, his head leaning against the shepherd. He wasn't part of the investigation unfolding in words and files, but his silence hovered over it all. The truth he had carried, dismissed for so long, was finally being matched with evidence. Claire looked at Adams, her voice firm now. We need to bring Kane in. Question him. His timeline on the night Daniel died is shaky at best. And Martha? Adams asked, his tone sharper than intended. Claire hesitated. She could be covering for him, or she could be terrified. If Kane threatened her, she'd have reason to lie under oath. The room shifted with unease. Martha Parker's trembling insistence on accident replayed in each of their minds. Her words had always felt rehearsed, her grief oddly rigid. Now the suspicion had formed. Perhaps she hadn't been hiding her husband's stumble, but shielding her family from a far more dangerous truth. Sergeant Holt tapped a photo with his thick finger. Look at this. Kane was seen outside the Parker residence 2 nights before Daniel's death. The witness said he was shouting, threatening. Neighbors dismissed it as a business quarrel. But now? Now it was something else entirely. Adams leaned on the table, palms flat, voice low. Inheritance, financial ruin, rage, a scarred hand, a ring that gleams. It all points to Kane. He straightened, conviction hardening in his chest. We're done chasing shadows. It's time to pull him in. Grace's eyes flicked to Ethan. The boy wasn't looking at the evidence, but his small fingers pressed harder into Lumos's fur. His brow furrowed, as though he felt the shift in the room, even without the words. He whispered something into the shepherd's ear, too quiet for anyone else to hear. Lumos's tail thumped once, steady, reassuring. The boy's silence had given them fragments. Now those fragments were aligning into a picture bigger than anyone had anticipated. Claire gathered the photos, sliding them back into the file with deliberate care. "We thought this case was collapsing," she said quietly. "But the lies are starting to unravel, and when they do, they'll bury Kane with them." The room went still again, but it was no longer the stillness of confusion. It was anticipation. Somewhere in the city, Leonard Kane went about his evening unaware that the truth was circling him, built not by adult testimony, but by the whispered memory of a child and the patient loyalty of a dog who had listened when no one else would. The corridors of Manchester Crown Court were nearly empty after hours, the polished floors echoing only with the distant hum of cleaners and the faint creak of settling wood. In a side room reserved for witnesses, the air was heavy with exhaustion and unspoken truths. Martha Parker sat hunched in a chair by the window, her hands trembling in her lap. The scarf she always carried, Daniel's scarf, was twisted so tightly between her fingers it looked ready to tear. The lines around her mouth were deeper tonight, her shoulders rigid, as if bracing against a blow that had already fallen. Ethan sat across the room with Lumos at his feet. The boy leaned against the shepherd's side, his small hand buried in thick fur, his toy car resting in his palm. His eyes were fixed on the floor, silent as always, but the weight of his gaze pressed against his mother more heavily than any words. For a long time, Martha said nothing. The only sound was the slow sweep of Lumos's breathing, steady, grounding. Then, finally, her voice cracked through the silence. "I didn't want to lie," she whispered. The boy's head lifted slightly, just enough to show he'd heard. Her hands clenched tighter around the scarf. "It wasn't an accident. I knew it wasn't. I knew the moment I saw him at the bottom of the stairs. But Leonard Kane," her voice broke on the name. "He came to me the next morning. He told me if I didn't say it was an accident, if I didn't protect him, he would make sure I lost more than Daniel. He said I'd lose you." Ethan's eyes widened. His fingers froze against Lumos's coat. Martha's tears came then, sudden and unrestrained. "He showed me the scar, Ethan. He showed me the knife he still carried. He made me swear. He said children could be taken away, that accidents could happen to little boys who spoke too much. I thought—" She pressed the scarf to her face, sobbing into the fabric. "I thought silence would keep you safe." The words hung between them, raw and jagged. Ethan shifted in his chair, the toy car clutched tighter in his fist. His lips parted as though to speak, but the sound died before it could form. He leaned harder into Lumos, the shepherd sensing the child's turmoil, pressing closer in return. Martha reached out a hand toward her son, palm trembling in the low light. "I wanted to protect you," she whispered desperately. "Please believe that. Every time I said accident, every time I swallowed the truth, it wasn't because I didn't love him. It was because I loved you. I couldn't risk Kane hurting you too." Her hand hovered in the space between them, empty. Ethan looked at it, his chest rising and falling in uneven bursts. His small shoulders stiffened. Slowly, he turned his face away, burying it deeper into Lumos's fur. The rejection was silent but piercing. Martha's hand dropped back to her lap as she broke into fresh sobs. She bent forward, the scarf muffling her cries, her entire frame shaking. "I'm sorry," she whispered over and over, as if repetition might undo years of fear. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I'm so sorry." Grace stood quietly in the doorway, unseen until now. She had heard enough to understand, and yet she didn't intrude. She only watched as mother and son sat divided by fear and truth. The gap between them bridged only by the steady presence of a shepherd who had become their anchor. Ethan lifted his head at last, his eyes rimmed red, though no tears fell. He looked at his mother, not with hatred, but with something colder, distance. His silence wasn't a wall this time, but a verdict. He had heard her, but forgiveness was still far away. He turned back to Lumos, whispering words only the dog could hear. Lumos's tail gave a faint thump, his amber eyes soft as though absorbing the pain the boy could not share with anyone else. Martha saw the whisper, saw the way her son chose a dog over her, and it cut her deeper than any threat Cain had ever made. She folded into herself, rocking slightly, her voice breaking into a plea. "Please, Ethan. One day, let me hold you again. One day, let me be your mother." But the boy didn't move. The room held only the sound of her weeping and the quiet steadiness of a child who had learned too early that survival sometimes meant silence. And in that silence, Martha's fear finally surfaced. Not of Cain, not of the court, but of the possibility that her son's trust might be gone forever. The courtroom was silent before the session even began, as if the walls themselves had learned to listen. Every bench was filled. Reporters leaned forward. Jurors gripped pens that hovered, but did not move. The stillness carried weight because today the child who had not spoken in weeks would be called to the stand. When the doors opened, it was not the bailiff or the attorneys who drew attention. It was the boy. Ethan Parker walked slowly, one hand clutching a toy car, the other buried in the fur of the German shepherd at his side. Lumos matched his pace perfectly, steady, patient, ears tuned to every tremor. Grace followed close behind, protective and silent. Ethan climbed into the witness chair with effort, his feet dangling above the floor. Lumos curled at his feet, close enough that the boy's legs pressed into his warmth. The shepherd's tail brushed the wood once, then went still. Judge Harrington adjusted his spectacles. His stern face gave nothing away, though his chest tightened at the sense of history unfolding. He nodded. "Proceed." Prosecutor Adams rose, his usual sharpness replaced with gentleness. "Ethan, can you tell us about that night?" "Only what you remember." The boy's gaze stayed on Lumos. His lips trembled, then parted. The voice was fragile, but it was there. I woke up." The jury rippled, pens scratching. Reporters froze, ears straining. Ethan's hand tightened in Lumos's fur. His eyes flicked to the defense table, where Victor sat rigid. His voice faltered. Adams leaned forward. "You don't have to look at anyone but Lumos. Tell him, and we'll listen too." The boy swallowed, chest rising fast. Then halting words came. "I heard the stairs. They creaked. Someone was there." Jurors leaned closer. Each short sentence carried more weight than volumes of evidence. There was a hand. Big. It had a scar and a ring. It shined when the light hit. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Ethan's eyes welled, but Lumos pressed closer, steadying him. He pushed. Daddy fell down the stairs. I heard him cry out. Then it was quiet. The last word cracked, fragile as glass. Murmurs broke out. Collins, the defense attorney, leapt to his feet. Objection! Nothing but a child's nightmare. Fragmented, unsubstantiated. Sit down, Mr. Collins. The judge's gavel cracked once. His gaze softened toward Ethan. Go on, son. Just a little more. Ethan hesitated. Silence threatened to close in. Then Lumos brushed his wrist with his muzzle. The boy blinked, breathed, and continued. Mommy, she came after. She screamed. She saw him, the man with the scar. He told her to say it was an accident. He said bad things would happen if she didn't. In the gallery, Martha Parker pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling as the truth her son had carried broke into the open. The room erupted. Gasps, hurried scribbles, voices rising. The gavel struck again and again. Adams raised a calming hand, crouching so his eyes met Ethan's. One last question. Do you know who the man with the scar was? Ethan froze. His throat tightened. His hand clung desperately to Lumos. His gaze darted once toward Victor, then away. His voice emerged as a whisper, only the first row could hear. Leonard Kane. The name spread like fire. Jurors stiffened. Reporters scrambled. Collins shouted in protest, nearly drowned by the uproar. But there sat the boy, his hand in the shepherd's fur, his voice, at last, free. The judge struck the gavel hard. Let the record show. The witness has testified under oath. His words will be entered into evidence. Ethan slumped, exhausted, his head falling against Lumos's side. The shepherd exhaled, steady, as if carrying the weight himself. For the first time, the truth of that night no longer belonged to silence. It belonged to the court. Judge Harrington turned. Defense may cross-examine. All eyes followed Collins as he rose smoothly, adjusting his tie, his expression genial but sharp. He approached the boy with the confidence of a man used to dismantling fragile truths. Ethan shrank slightly. Lumos shifted, pressing firmly against the boy's leg, a silent anchor. Collins smiled faintly. Good morning, Ethan. You've been very brave, speaking in front of all these people. The boy stayed silent, his hand buried in fur. Collins clasped his hands behind his back, pacing. But sometimes, when children are upset, when they lose someone they love, he glanced at the jury. They can confuse dreams with reality. Isn't that true? Ethan said nothing. You've had nightmares since your father died, haven't you? Bad dreams about scary men? The boy's lips pressed tight. His silence looked like retreat. Collins pounced. Your mother said it was an accident. Maybe you just imagined someone pushed him, because you couldn't accept the truth. Jurors shifted uneasily. Reporters scribbled. Collins softened his tone. You said you saw a scar, a ring. But children imagine shiny things in the dark all the time. Isn't it possible you dreamed it? Panic fluttered in Ethan's chest. His knuckles whitened in Lumos's fur. Grace, watching, held her breath. This was the breaking point. Collins leaned closer, voice low. You don't want to lie in court, do you? Has anyone told you what to say? The insinuation spread like poison. Ethan's lips trembled. Silence pressed in. Then Lumos shifted again, warm against his side. The boy lifted his head, eyes fixed on the dog. His voice was thin, but steady. No one told me. Collins straightened, startled. What was that? I saw it. The scar. The ring. He pushed Daddy. A ripple passed through the jury. Adams's chest tightened with pride he dared not show. Collins's smile faltered. He pressed again. Are you sure you're not mistaken? That it wasn't just a dream? The boy shook his head fiercely. It wasn't a dream. It was real. Gasps echoed. Reporters' pens scratched furiously. Judge Harrington's hand rose. That's enough. His gavel struck. The witness has answered. Defense will not badger a child. Collins's jaw tightened. He returned to his seat, his smirk brittle. Ethan slumped in his chair, drained, but his hand never left Lumos. The shepherd lowered his head into the boy's lap, content. For the jury, the image was indelible. A boy clinging to a dog, trembling yet unwavering. His truth had survived cross-examination. The silence that followed was not doubt. It was belief, settling quietly in the room. Outside, the courthouse steps were swarmed before adjournment. Reporters rushed to phones and cameras, headlines already forming. The boy had spoken. The dog had stayed. Inside, jurors filed out, their expressions grave. Most were silent, still hearing Ethan's voice. It wasn't a dream. It was real. Prosecutor Adams loosened his tie. Exhaustion etched across his face. We've gained the public, he murmured to Claire Morrison. Public support doesn't convict, she replied. We still need tangible proof. Collins will press harder. Adams nodded grimly. Then we found the hammer. We put the weapon in their hands. But even as he spoke, hope stirred. For weeks the case had been collapsing under silence. Now, the tide was shifting, anchored by an old shepherd who had asked for nothing more than a place to rest his head. Reporters crowded Grace and Ethan as they left, cameras flashing. Grace, how long has Lumos been with children? Do you believe the testimony will stand? Is Lumos part of the witness team now? Her answers were brief. Lumos is here for Ethan. That's all that matters. The shepherd ignored the chaos, steady as ever. Ethan pressed close, his hand never leaving the fur at Lumos's shoulder. That night, news anchors spoke not only of scars and stares, but of the bond between a boy and a dog. A split screen showed the courtroom sketch of Ethan whispering to Lumos, and the photo of him leaning against the shepherd on the stand. The next morning's headlines were bold. The boy speaks, dog breaks, silence, #justice, with Lumos trending nationwide. Yet in the prosecutor's office, Adams warned his team. Public movements don't decide trials. Evidence does. Kane's lawyers will fight harder now. Claire tapped the evidence file. Then we leave them no shadows to hide in. Back in his bedroom, Ethan curled under the blankets. The toy car sat untouched on the nightstand. Lumos lay at the foot of the bed, his ears twitching as Ethan whispered softly into the dark. For the first time since that night on the staircase, the boy's voice had been heard. And though the battle was far from over, silence no longer belonged to fear. It belonged to truth. The gallery buzzed as the oak doors opened. Leonard Kane entered. Broad-shouldered, jaw set, swagger intact. But sweat clung to him like a shadow. What drew every eye, though, were his hands. Sleek, black leather gloves in summer. Reporters scribbled furiously. Jurors glanced at each other. Gloves were a strange choice for a man on trial for murder. Kane sat in the witness box with a rehearsed smirk, nodding politely to the judge. His performance was polished, the mask of wealth and indifference. But masks crack under weight. "Mr. Kane," Judge Harrington said, "you're under oath." "Of course," Kane replied smoothly. Adams began his questions. Kane answered with ease, talking of lawsuits, business quarrels, Parker's stubbornness. His voice was calm, his words careful. Then he adjusted his collar, leather creasing over his knuckles. In the front row, Ethan froze. His eyes widened, breath caught. The memory surged, a scar, a ring, the shove. He pressed into Lumos, whispering so softly only the shepherd heard. "That's him." Grace saw the boy's lips move. She followed his gaze to the gloves. Adams's eyes narrowed. "Why the gloves, Mr. Kane?" Kane chuckled. "Habit, sensitive skin, doctor's orders." Murmurs rippled. The jury scribbled. Adams stepped closer. "Or something you'd rather the court not see?" "Objection," Collins barked. "Badgering." "Sustained," said the judge, though his frown deepened. The seed was planted. Ethan whispered again into Loomis's fur. "The scar. It's under the glove." The shepherd's tail swept once across the floor. Later, Adams rose again, steel in his voice. "You testified you had no contact with Daniel Parker before his death." "That's correct," Kane smirked. Adams lifted a photograph. "This was taken outside the Parker residence, 2 nights before his death. Witnesses saw you there, arguing, threatening." Gasps rippled as the photo passed to the jury. Kane, arm raised mid-gesture, his bare right hand visible. Scar jagged across the knuckles. Kane's smirk faltered, then returned weakly. A smear on the lens. People see what they want to see. Adam's tone cut sharper. "And this?" He held up another photo. Kane at a fundraiser. Scar and ring glinting in the light. The same scar a child described under oath. Kane's jaw ticked. He tugged at his glove. "Scars don't make me a murderer." "No," Adams shot back, "but they make you a liar." The gallery erupted. Jurors leaned forward. Judge Harrington's gavel thundered. "Mr. Kane, remove the gloves." Kane froze. Sweat dotted his temple. Slowly he peeled them off. The scar stretched pale and jagged across his knuckles. Gasps filled the chamber. Reporters nearly leapt from benches. Jurors scribbled furiously. Adams's voice rang steady. "The scar Daniel Parker's son described. The scar neighbors saw. The scar in photographs. The truth you tried to hide." Kane sneered. "A scar proves nothing. I didn't kill him." "Then why lie?" Adams pressed, his words a blade. "Why hide your hands? Why deny being at his house? Why threaten his family? Tell this court, why did Daniel Parker end up dead at the bottom of his staircase?" Kane's composure cracked. "Because he was a fool. Because he stole from me. Because—" He stopped. Too late. The venom was out. Gasps tore through the gallery. Adams stepped closer. "So you admit you confronted him?" Kane's chest heaved. His hand slammed the rail of the witness box. The sound cracked like thunder. The scar blazed under the lights. The gallery exploded. "That's it." The boy knew. He showed it. Ethan flinched at the noise, clinging to Lumos, whispering once more, "That's him." The shepherd's amber eyes locked on Kane, unmoving, as though he too bore witness. Judge Harrington's gavel pounded for order. Adams's voice cut through the chaos. "Ladies and gentlemen, you saw it with your own eyes. The scar, the rage, the lie unraveled. Leonard Kane exposed himself before this court." Collins's protests were drowned by the roar of the gallery. And there it was. The mask shattered, the scar revealed, the boy's memory confirmed. For the first time, the face of the villain stood bare before the jury. The courtroom was electric. The scar had been revealed, the boy had whispered recognition, and now the nation waited for the next voice. When Judge Harrington called the order, all eyes turned to the witness list. At the top, Martha Parker. She entered slowly, scarf clutched tight, her shoulders bent under weeks of silence. But in her eyes was something new, a resolve edged with fear. Gasps filled the gallery as she climbed the witness stand. "Mrs. Parker," the judge said, "you are under oath." "I understand," she whispered. Prosecutor Adams's voice softened. "You've told this court your husband's death was an accident, that he fell. Do you stand by that?" Her hands twisted the scarf until the fabric strained. She glanced at the front row, at her son, clutching Lumos, refusing her eyes. Tears broke through. "No," she said. Her voice cracked. "It wasn't an accident." The gallery erupted. The gavel thundered. When silence returned, Adams pressed, "Tell the court what really happened." Her words came halting at first, then like floodwater. "The morning after Daniel's death, Leonard Kane came to me. He said if I told anyone the truth, Ethan would be next. He said accidents happen to little boys. He showed me his scar. He pressed a knife against my table. He made me swear to call it an accident." Her sobs shook the chamber. "I lied to save my son." The room fell to a stunned hush. "Mrs. Parker," Adams asked, "can you confirm your son's testimony, that a man with a scar and a ring pushed his father?" She turned toward the jury, tear-streaked but clear. "Yes, it's the truth. My son told you the truth. I silenced him to protect him, but no more." The gallery erupted again, reporters scribbling furiously. At the defense table, Kane's jaw tightened, his ring glinting as his fist clenched. His mask was peeling. In the front row, Ethan whispered into Lumos's ear. "She said it." The shepherd's tail brushed once against the floor. Adams rose, the weight of weeks condensed into one moment. "Your Honor," he said, voice ringing, "we now have the full picture." He turned to the jury, pacing slowly. Leonard Kane had a motive. Daniel Parker's fortune, business rivalries, financial ruin. He needed Parker gone. And when greed met opportunity, he struck. Adams's hand cut through the air, pointing toward Kane. "You've seen the scar. The same scar a 7-year-old described under oath. The same scar in photographs. The same scar Mr. Kane hid under gloves." Kane sat rigid, jaw clenched. "You've heard Mrs. Parker testify that Kane threatened her and her son. He forced her silence. He buried Daniel Parker twice, once under the staircase, and once under a lie." The gallery murmured. "And you've heard the boy," Adams continued. His voice dropped to near reverence. "A child who had every reason to stay silent, who only spoke when he felt safe. He told you what he saw. A scar, a ring, a push. He told you what he heard, threats against his mother. His voice did not waver, even under cross-examination." He paused, letting the silence grow heavy. The jury leaned forward, pens forgotten. "This is not speculation. This is testimony. This is evidence. And all of it points to one man, Leonard Kane." Collins sprang to his feet. "Objection!" Grandstanding. Overruled, the judge snapped. Adams's voice cut sharp as a blade. Truth surfaces, no matter how many gloves he wears, no matter how many lies he tells. Daniel Parker deserves justice. Ethan Parker deserves safety, and the only way to give them both is to hold Leonard Kane accountable. He sat down slowly, his face calm, though his pulse hammered. For a moment, the courtroom held its breath. Then Leonard Kane broke. His jaw twitched, his fists clenched. The smirk was gone. Sweat glistened at his temple. "You think you've got me?" His voice boomed suddenly. "A boy's fantasies, a weeping widow, photographs, that's your case?" Gasps rippled. Collins hissed at him to sit, but Kane surged on. "You people don't know a damn thing. Daniel Parker cheated me, stole from me, ruined me. He deserved what he got." The words cracked like gunfire. Reporters nearly fell over their benches. The jury recoiled. Adams shot up. "So you admit you confronted him?" "I warned him," Kane roared, scarred hand jabbing toward the jury. "I told him if he crossed me again he'd pay. And I'll say it again here. I don't regret it." Chaos erupted. Judge Harrington's gavel slammed. "Order!" But Kane was unstoppable. "You think a mutt and a child's whispers make me guilty? You're fools, all of you." Bailiffs surged forward. Kane shoved one back. "Don't touch me." "You'll regret this." His voice cracked into a snarl. He deserved it. The bailiffs wrestled him down, shackling his wrists. His scarred hand clawed against the wood one last time before disappearing beneath their grip. And just like that, it was over. Kane sagged, chest heaving, his mask shattered beyond repair. The silence that followed was heavier than any gavel. Jurors stared, pale and rigid. Reporters scribbled with wide-eyed disbelief. At the front row, Ethan clung to Lumos, whispering into the shepherd's ear. "That's him. That's the man." Lumos pressed closer, amber eyes locked on Kane, unflinching. Judge Harrington lowered his gavel slowly, his voice grave. "Let the record reflect the witness's outburst and the necessity of restraint. This court will not be intimidated, and this trial will continue." But everyone in that chamber already felt it. The verdict was no longer in doubt. And in the quiet that followed, Ethan leaned against Lumos, whispering, "It's almost over." For the first time since the night of the fall, the words felt true. The jury had filed out, leaving the courtroom hollow. Heavy oak doors closed behind them, the echo carrying like a funeral bell. For the first time in days, the room was still. No objections, no testimony, only waiting. Hours dragged like stones. The gallery thinned. Though reporters lingered, pens tapping against paper, eyes fixed on the sealed jury room. At the prosecution table, Adams leaned close to Claire Morrison, exhaustion lining his face. Across the aisle, defense attorney Collins sat stiff, his client, Leonard Kane, bound at the wrists, fury simmering in his scarred hand. But the heart of the waiting was not at the lawyers' tables. It was in the front row, where Ethan Parker leaned into the steady warmth of Lumos. The boy's cheek pressed against the shepherd's thick fur, his chipped toy car loose in his palm. At first he fought to stay awake, eyelids fluttering each time the doors creaked, but eventually fatigue overcame fear, and his breathing steadied into sleep. Lumos did not move. His chest rose and fell in calm cadence, ears twitching, amber eyes half closed. He seemed to know his greatest duty now was not vigilance, but comfort. To Ethan, he was not simply a companion, he was a fortress. Across the aisle, Martha Parker sat alone, scarf crumpled in her lap, shoulders bent beneath the weight of her confession. She had told the truth at last, but it had come too late. Her son, curled not in her arms, but in the fur of the dog who had believed him from the start, was both her salvation and her punishment. Each time she glanced at him, her heart broke. Will he ever forgive me? Grace Williams watched from the aisle, noting the boy's subtle flinches at each door slam, the mother's quiet sobs, the gap between them. It was a bridge no one could build in a single day. Time stretched. Shadows lengthened across the benches. Outside, the storm of headlines and protests raged, but inside the storm had shrunk to this: a boy, a dog, and the unbearable stillness of waiting for judgment. At last, the doors opened. 12 solemn faces filed back in, their expressions carved from stone. Judge Harrington's voice was heavy. "Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The foreman stood. His voice trembled as he read, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Leonard Kane, guilty of murder in the second degree." The words struck like thunder. Gasps erupted. Martha wept openly. Reporters scribbled furiously. Jurors sank back in their seats. In the front row, Ethan froze. For a heartbeat, he did not move. Then his small hand clenched tighter into Lumos's fur, his whisper fragile but sure. "They believed me." Lumos pressed closer, anchoring him. Across the courtroom, Kane erupted, cursing, slamming his chained hand against the rail. Bailiffs restrained him as he roared, "This is a lie! A setup!" But his fury only underscored the finality of the verdict. Judge Harrington's gavel cracked like a gunshot. "Order!" His face was grave as he delivered the sentence. Life imprisonment without parole. Kane sagged, shackled, eyes darting wildly for allies and finding none. Reporters captured every flicker. The boy whispering to his dog, the mother sobbing into her scarf, the scarred man dragged away in chains. Then something unexpected happened. Harrington did not immediately adjourn. He let silence hang, heavy as stone, before leaning forward. "This court has seen many trials," he began, gravel in his voice, "but none like this, where justice hinged not on experts or wealth, but on the trembling voice of a child who had every reason to remain silent." The gallery stilled. Reporters lowered their pens. "Justice," the judge continued, eyes settling on Ethan, "was not delivered today by the thunder of rhetoric or the weight of intimidation. It was found in something smaller, something far more fragile. It was found in a whisper carried by the courage of a child and anchored by the loyalty of a dog." Gasps swept the room. Martha pressed her scarf to her mouth, tears streaming. Grace closed her eyes, storing the words deep in memory. Ethan blinked, stunned, then buried his face into Lumos's fur. His whisper was too soft for the room, but enough for the shepherd's ears. "He heard me." Lumos's tail thumped once, steady as a heartbeat. The judge's voice grew firmer. "Let it be remembered that this verdict was not written in silence nor in fear, but in truth that could not be buried. A boy's courage broke the shadows. A dog's loyalty held him steady. And together, they gave this court what it seeks above all else: justice." The gavel fell one last time, not like an ending, but like a benediction. Reporters rushed for the doors, already crafting headlines that echoed his words. Justice found in a whisper. The courage of a child. The loyalty of a dog. Martha wept openly, torn between guilt and fragile hope. Adams sat with quiet pride, knowing this case had not been won by law alone, but by something far more human. And Ethan, pressed into Lumos's fur, finally let his small shoulders shake with release. The world around him erupted in motion, but for him, it was quiet now. Justice had been spoken, not in shouts, not in rage, but in a whisper the world could no longer ignore. The courthouse doors groaned open, spilling light and bodies into the world outside. The trial of Leonard Kane was over, but its echoes were only beginning. The steps were packed with people, reporters, photographers, protesters, and citizens drawn by something deeper than curiosity. They weren't there for headlines alone. They wanted to glimpse the boy who had finally spoken and the dog who had carried him through it. When the bailiffs guided the family out, the roar began. "Ethan, look this way." "Grace, is Lumos under witness protection now?" "Mrs. Parker, will you comment on your testimony?" Microphones jabbed forward like spears, cameras strobed, voices collided into a tide that could drown anyone. Ethan froze at the top step. His small hands shook. The toy car nearly slipped from his grip. His chest rose in ragged bursts. Then Lumos moved. The shepherd pressed against the boy's side, nudging with a steady flank. Ethan's fingers tangled in the thick fur at his neck. He bent down, face hidden in the dog's shoulder, letting Lumos absorb the storm. Grace's hand landed on his back. "Enough," she snapped at the reporters. "He's a child. Give him space." But the crowd surged closer, their hunger undimmed. Cameras clicked. Headlines were already forming. The silent boy and his dog. Whisper of justice. Lumos the hero. Adam stepped forward, voice cutting sharp through the din. "No more questions. The boy has testified. Respect his privacy." The authority in his words forced a pause. Reporters drew back, their frenzy softening into distance shots. Still, the lenses lingered on Lumos. His grey muzzle, calm, amber eyes. The child clinging to him with both fear and trust. It was an image that required no caption. Within hours, it would circle the world. Ethan finally lifted his head, pale in the light. The crowd blurred before him. Too many faces, too many eyes. He whispered into the dog's ear, "Don't leave me." Lumos pressed closer, steady, as if to promise he never would. Behind them, Martha trailed with swollen eyes and scarf clutched tight. She let the cameras see her son and the dog, knowing they had carried the truth she could not. Then something shifted. From the edge of the crowd, applause broke out. Quiet at first, then swelling into a wave that rolled down the courthouse steps. Strangers clapped, some wept, others lifted phones, voices rose, not in accusation but in reverence. "Justice with Lumos! Courage of a child!" Placards lifted. "Justice with Lumos! Silent boy! Speaks! Healing in fur!" Ethan flinched, but this sound was different. These weren't whispers of doubt. These were voices of people who believed. He turned to Lumos, murmuring, "They're cheering for you." The dog's tail swept once, slow, grounding. Adams watched, his face softening. He knew this wasn't just a legal victory. It was something larger, something no courtroom could contain. Grace ushered them down the steps toward the waiting car. The chant rose behind them. "Justice with Lumos! Justice with Lumos!" Ethan ducked inside, Lumos following. The boy buried his face into the dog's fur again, safe inside the rhythm of a beating heart. Outside, cameras flashed. Inside, there was only that warmth. "You're my hero," Ethan whispered. Lumos pressed his muzzle gently against the boy's chest. No medal mattered, only this. The cemetery lay still under the morning haze. Dew jeweled the grass, the air smelling faintly of rain. Ethan walked slowly, clutching Lumos's leash, though the shepherd hardly needed it. Martha followed, scarf wound tightly, pale but determined. They stopped before a simple stone, Daniel Parker. Fresh flowers lay at its base. Ethan froze. For weeks he had avoided this place. afraid to face the finality of his father's absence. Now, with Lumos pressed close and his mother lingering behind, he took one step nearer. Martha's voice broke the silence. "I should have brought you here sooner," she whispered. "I thought it would hurt too much for both of us." Ethan said nothing. He stared at the stone, clutching his toy car. Lumos lowered himself onto the grass, close enough for the boy to lean. Martha knelt, fingertips brushing across her husband's name. "I'm so sorry, Daniel. I let fear guide me. I stayed silent when I should have fought. I thought I was protecting Ethan, but I failed you both." Tears streaked down her face. Ethan sank beside Lumos, cheek pressed to warm fur. For a long time they sat, mother weeping, son leaning on the dog, the grave between them like both a barrier and bridge. Finally, the boy lifted his head, his voice, thin but steady. "Daddy knows the truth now." Martha's breath caught. "Yes, sweetheart, he does." With trembling hands, Ethan placed the chipped toy car at the base of the stone. It had been his talisman, his link to the father who used to roll it across the kitchen floor. Setting it there felt like giving a piece of himself back. He whispered into Lumos's fur, "You help me tell him." The dog's tail brushed the grass. Martha reached out, resting her hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I don't expect forgiveness. Not now, maybe not ever. But I want you to know, I believe you. I always believed you. I was just too afraid to say it." The boy stiffened, but didn't pull away. His silence wasn't rejection. It was the fragile first step of trust returning. Lumos pressed closer to them both, stitching them together with his presence. The cemetery air shifted. It felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. Martha bowed her head near her son's. "We'll get through this. Together. With Lumos. I won't let fear silence me again." Ethan looked at her, wounded, but not closed. He didn't answer, only leaned back into Lumos, and that was enough. For now, a beginning. Night fell softly on the little house. Outside, the street was hushed, a cat crossing like a shadow, a porch light glowing faintly. Inside, the kitchen clock ticked with the patience of old things. Martha stood in the doorway of Ethan's room. On the floor beside the bed, Lumos lay curled, chest rising slowly and even, head turned toward the boy. Ethan lay with one arm draped across the shepherd's chest, ear tucked against heartbeat. For the first time since the night everything changed, his breathing matched another's. The toy car sat on the nightstand, its paint dulled, wheels loose, now facing the open window as if ready to roll toward memory. A breeze carried the scent of wet leaves. Somewhere far off, a siren rose and faded. Martha entered quietly, laying her scarf on a chair. She knelt, close enough to touch Ethan's hair, but choosing instead to rest her hand against Lumos's neck. "Thank you," she whispered. His tail thumped once against the floor. Judge Harrington's words lingered like a benediction through the quiet house. Justice was found in a whisper, carried by the courage of a child and the loyalty of a dog. On the muted television in the other room, headlines scrolled, "Justice with Lumos. The silent boy speaks. Verdict, guilty." Martha understood now how stories consume, how they turn flesh and bone into symbols. But when she turned back to the bed, she saw her truest story. A boy asleep at last, and a dog keeping watch. Ethan stirred, pressing his palm more firmly over Lumos's ribs. The dog breathed deeper, as if to say, "Yes, I'm here." In sleep, Ethan's brow smoothed, his lips parted in the lightest sigh. Martha leaned against the bed frame, closing her eyes. The voices of fear and blame receded. The house spoke smaller truths, fabric settling, a paw twitching, the feather scratch of a child's hair against linen. She let those fill her like a new kind of prayer. Morning would bring apologies, therapists, long walks, dinners set at the table, visits to the grave. The world would return in pieces. She believed this now. For tonight, healing had begun. In a child's even breathing. In the steady heart of a dog who never left. In the silence that no longer felt empty. For tonight, there was only what could fit in a room. Ethan's arm shifted. His hand slid higher along Lumos's chest. Fingers fixing themselves in the rough there, like an anchor, dropped and catching. The shepherd exhaled, a sound close to a human's contentment, then went still again. Their chests rose together, fell together, rose. It would not make sense to everyone that a case could turn not on a brief bristling with footnotes, but on the unembellished courage of a small voice and the ballast of a quiet animal. But sense and truth are cousins, not twins. Some truths refuse the loud room and choose another way in. Sometimes justice doesn't come from laws or lawyers at all. Sometimes it arrives the way dawn does, quiet, inevitable, spilling over a ledge of darkness because a boy found the strength to whisper and a dog stood still long enough to catch the words. Sometimes the bravest thing is not to speak eloquently, but to lay your head where a faithful heart is beating and let that rhythm teach your lungs how to breathe again. Martha opened her eyes and looked at her son. He slept with his mouth slightly open, a smear of moonlight across his cheek, his lashes making shadows like the strokes of a soft brush. She looked at Lumos, the dog who had altered the angle of their days, and found her own breath falling into step with theirs. In the smallness of this room, all the thunder of the world quieted to a pulse she could bear. The breeze lifted the curtain, then let it fall. The clock ticked. The house was held. Ethan did not stir. His breathing stayed even. He slept with his head on Lumos's chest. Both of them travelers arrived at last, the night keeping its gentle watch. And in that steady music, breath to breath, boy to dog, the story found its true ending and its truest beginning. Some stories end quietly, with a child breathing easy and a good dog keeping watch. What stays is the simple truth many of us learned long ago. Animals don't argue their love, they live it. German shepherds, especially, carry a kind of steadfast loyalty that doesn't shout. It stands beside you, listens, and waits until your heart is ready. If you're feeling that tug to deepen things with your own dog, I'd love to point you toward a gentle, no-nonsense resource that helps you hear what your dog's been saying all along. Practical, kind, and made for folks who value trust over tricks. No hustle, no sales pitch. If that sounds useful, just say the word and I'll share it. In the meantime, give your dog an extra scratch tonight. Sometimes the best medicine is a warm muzzle, a steady heartbeat, and the knowing that you're not alone.